The rain hit the windshield so hard, it was almost impossible to see, but Zachary Boone wasn't about to let that stop him. Not with his 8-year-old daughter fast asleep in the seat behind him, her tiny hand still clutching the stuffed panda. She never went anywhere without. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, squinting through the downpour, when he saw her standing on the side of the road in heels, drenched, her arms around herself like she was holding her world together. Zach slowed down instinctively. She didn't look like someone who belonged out here. Her coat was soaked through, hair plastered to her face. There was a kind of elegance to her, even in the storm. She didn't wave him down. She just stood there like she didn't expect anyone to stop. He rolled down the passenger window. "You all right?" Her eyes lifted to his, wide and blue and filled with something shock, maybe, or relief. "My car died. I've been trying to call a cab for the last 30 minutes. Nothing's coming out here in this storm." He looked at her again. She was shivering, clearly freezing. "Look, I've got my daughter in the back seat, but if you don't mind sharing the ride, I can drop you wherever you're going." She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Thank you." As she climbed in, careful not to drip water on the little girl behind them, Zach glanced back at his daughter. "Ellery, baby, this is." "Paloma," the woman offered, breathless, brushing water from her face. "Paloma Hart." Ellery blinked sleepily. "Hi." Paloma smiled softly. "Hi, sweet girl." Zach pulled back onto the road. The silence in the car only filled by the storm and the steady breathing of his daughter falling back asleep behind them. "You live around here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Actually, I was trying to get back to the city. I had a work thing out this way. My driver canceled last minute, so I rented a car. Bad idea." He glanced at her again. Her earrings looked expensive, but her coat was plain. She didn't wear a lot of makeup, and yet there was something about the way she sat graceful, controlled, like she grew up with money but didn't want to show it. "You work in the city?" She nodded. "Yeah." Zach didn't press. He wasn't the type to pry. Still, he couldn't stop sneaking glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way she tucked her damp hair behind her ear, the way her eyes softened when they landed on Ellery. 35 minutes later, they pulled up in front of an upscale building in Manhattan with a doorman waiting under the awning, holding an umbrella. "You live here?" he asked, eyebrows raising. Paloma hesitated. "Yes." Zach looked up at the towering building, then back at her. "This your work thing?" She gave him a crooked smile. "Something like that." Before he could ask more, the doorman opened her door. "Miss Hart, we've been worried. Your assistant called." "I'm fine, James," she interrupted gently, then turned back to Zach. "Thank you for stopping, for the ride." He nodded. "Anytime." She leaned in a little, lowering her voice. "You have a good heart and a beautiful daughter." Zach blinked, caught off guard, but before he could say anything, she was already stepping out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. She turned back one last time, gave a small wave to Ellery, then disappeared under the awning. Zach pulled away, his mind full of questions he didn't know how to ask. He had no idea the woman he just dropped off was one of the wealthiest tech investors in the country. And he definitely didn't expect to see her again. 2 days later, Paloma sat in a boardroom on the 54th floor of Hart Global, pretending to care about quarterly projections. But her mind kept drifting back to the man in the truck with the tired eyes and the little girl who smiled in her sleep. Zach Boone. She hadn't stopped thinking about him, not once. There was something about the way he'd looked at her like he saw her, not her wealth, not her name, just her. And for some reason she couldn't explain, she wanted to see him again. Zach didn't expect to find her sitting on a bench outside the community center, where he picked Ellery up from her after-school art class. He froze when he saw her. Paloma, he asked, stunned. She stood, smiling nervously. Hope this isn't weird. I asked around. They said you volunteered here sometimes. He blinked. Yeah, just helping out when I can. She looked down, then back up. Can I buy you dinner? He stared, stunned. You want to buy me dinner? She laughed. You saved me from becoming a storm statistic. I figure, owe you one. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know, Ellery. Can come too, she said quickly. I'd love that. Paloma glanced toward the door just as Ellery came running out. Daddy. Zach caught her in his arms. Paloma's smile widened. Hi, Ellery. The little girl blinked. You're the rain lady. Paloma laughed. I guess I am. Zach looked between them, still trying to wrap his head around what was happening. Dinner's on me, she said again. No strings. Her eyes searched his, open and unguarded. He didn't know what this was, but whatever it was, he wasn't ready to walk away from it. Okay, he said finally, let's get dinner. The restaurant Paloma chose was tucked between a florist and a bookstore on a quiet corner in the West Village. It wasn't flashy, no white linen tablecloths or velvet ropes. Instead, the warm glow from the windows spilled onto the sidewalk, and the smell of garlic and fresh bread drifted into the night air. Zach held the door open for Ellery and Paloma, still unsure how he'd ended up here. He wasn't used to evenings like this one's that started with unexpected invitations and ended with his daughter humming along to soft Italian music, twirling spaghetti around her fork like she was in a movie. Paloma sat across from him, her jacket draped over the back of her chair. She'd changed since the storm, now in a navy blouse with one gold pin near the collarbone, subtle and elegant. Her hair was dry this time, loosely braided over one shoulder. She looked comfortable, but not careless. There was always precision beneath the ease, like everything about her had been designed with thought. Ellery, Paloma said, setting down her water glass, what's your favorite thing to draw? Birds, Ellery said instantly. Mostly owls, they look like they know secrets. Paloma tilted her head. That's very specific. Why owls? Ellery shrugged and reached for her breadstick. Because they don't talk much, but I think they know things people forget. Zach laughed under his breath. She's been like this since she could talk, always thinking sideways. Paloma leaned in slightly. That's a gift, you know, seeing things differently. Zach noticed the way she listened, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. She wasn't pretending to care. She really was interested. After Ellery finished her dinner, she curled up in the booth beside Zach and rested her head on his arm. Her eyes were already fluttering shut. I can call a car to take you back, Paloma offered softly. Looks like she's about to dream up a whole owl kingdom. Zach shook his head. It's all right, I drove. She glanced at him, eyebrows raised. Here, parking in the village at this hour. I've got a trick spot, he said. Take some maneuvering, but it's free. She smiled faintly, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Before you go, this is for you. He hesitated, then took it. Inside was a name and address one he didn't recognize, and a handwritten note. Come by tomorrow, she said, if you want. Zach looked at her uncertain. What is it? You'll see, she replied, rising from her seat. But bring Ellery, she'll love it. The next afternoon, Zach followed the GPS across the bridge into Brooklyn Heights, where the buildings stood proud and historic, like they'd been watching the city change for centuries. The address led to a tall, ivy-covered townhouse with wrought iron gates and a quiet, private garden just visible beyond. He carried Ellery on his hip as he rang the bell. It was Paloma who opened the door. She wore jeans and a rust-colored sweater that looked soft enough to sleep in, her feet bare against the hardwood floors. You came, she said, stepping aside. Not gonna lie, Zach said. I was half convinced this was a setup and I'd walk into some kind of pyramid scheme. Paloma laughed, tempting but no. Inside, the townhouse stretched back farther than it looked from the street. High ceilings, crown molding, and windows that let in so much light it felt like the walls were made of glass. But it wasn't cold or untouchable. There were books stacked messily, a record player spinning something jazzy in the corner, and a large art easel in the back room with half-finished sketches clipped to it. "Whoa," Ellery breathed, sliding down from Zach's arms and padding toward the easel. "Is this your house?" "Mine, yes," Paloma said, "but that studio's yours for the day. I thought you might like to try real charcoal." Ellery's eyes widened. "Seriously?" Paloma leaned closer. "You just have to promise not to draw any owls that cast spells." "No promises," Ellery said, already picking up a stick of charcoal. Zach watched her for a moment, then turned to Paloma. "This place is." She waited, arms crossed loosely. "Too much." He shook his head, unexpected. They moved into the kitchen, where the smell of cinnamon drifted from the oven. Paloma poured him coffee without asking how he took it, and somehow it was exactly right strong, no sugar, splash of cream. "You didn't just look me up, did you?" he asked. She met his gaze. "I did, but not for the reasons you think. I needed to know if what I felt that night was real." Zach's brow furrowed. "What did you feel?" "That you weren't afraid of me," she said. "Not of what I have or the name I carry. You didn't ask what I did or what I was worth. You asked if I was okay." He took a sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch. "I didn't realize kindness was so rare," he said finally. "In my world," she replied, "it's almost extinct." They sat quietly for a moment, the sounds of Ellery humming as she drew filling the space between them. "Why me?" Zach asked. Paloma tilted her head. "Why not you?" He exhaled slowly. "Because I'm not polished. Work 2 jobs, drive a truck that leaks when it rains. I haven't worn a tie in 5 years." Her voice was quiet. "You love your kids so much it shows in everything you do. You didn't flinch when you saw me standing in the storm. You didn't try to impress me. You just made sure I got home." Zach rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know where this is going." "Neither do I," she said, "but I know I want to find out." From the next room, Ellery shouted, "Hey, come see this owl. He's wearing a crown." Paloma stood, her eyes never leaving Zach's. "Come on, let's go meet the king." Zach didn't realize how quickly the days had started folding into each other, until the 3rd time he found himself at Paloma's townhouse with Ellery painting in the sunroom and him, somehow, sitting at a table that overlooked a courtyard garden he hadn't noticed before. Paloma was across from him again, this time barefoot and balancing 2 mugs of tea, one of which she slid toward him without asking what he wanted. He took it without a word, watching her settle into the chair. She tucked one leg beneath her while the other foot tapped against the rug absent-mindedly. "You always this quiet?" she asked, tilting her head. "Only when I'm trying to figure someone out," he said. "And I can't," he admitted, eyes steady on hers. "You don't make sense to me." She didn't blink. "What doesn't?" "You've got everything most people want, but you're always walking around like you're looking for something that's missing." She looked away then, not with shame but with a strange kind of recognition. "It's not missing, it just doesn't fit." "What doesn't?" "The life, the expectations, the rooms I'm always in." She met his eyes again. "And the people who never ask me why I'm tired." Zach leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "You don't seem tired." "That's because I stopped letting anyone see it," she said. "Until now." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded once and took a sip of the tea. It was strong and floral, not something he would have picked, but somehow exactly what he needed. From inside, Ellery's voice floated toward them. Something about a phoenix and whether it could share a nest with an owl. "She's got a wild brain," Paloma said, smiling faintly. "I know," Zach replied. "Sometimes worry she's too much for the world." Paloma's gaze stayed on the sunroom doorway. Or maybe the world's not enough for her. A long moment passed between them, not uncomfortable, just waited like they were both standing at the edge of something neither of them was ready to name. When he finally stood to help Ellery clean up, Paloma followed, and for the first time, she didn't hover. She sat back, watching father and daughter move together with a rhythm that was easy and unspoken. As Zach zipped Ellery's hoodie and slung her backpack over his shoulder, Paloma walked them to the door. He hesitated before stepping out. "You're not what I expected." "Likewise," she said. Zach opened his mouth, then closed it again. Instead, he nodded once and walked out into the early evening light. The next week, she showed up unannounced at the cafe where Zach worked mornings. He didn't notice her until his shift manager nudged him and nodded toward the corner table by the window. Paloma sat there in a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back into a low twist, a newspaper folded neatly beside her untouched croissant. "You stalking me now?" he asked as he slid into the booth across from her during his break. "I had a meeting 3 blocks away," she said. "I thought I'd stop by." He raised an eyebrow. "You honestly expect me to believe you walk anywhere?" She shrugged. "Maybe I needed the air." Zach leaned back, arms crossed. "All right, why are you really here?" Paloma ran her fingers along the edge of her mug. "I have a gala this Friday. It's a fundraiser for a literacy program I've been working on for years, and I want you to come." He blinked. "Me. And Ellery." He stared at her, half laughing under his breath. "You realize I don't own anything close to a tux, right?" "I wasn't expecting you to," she said. "I already took care of everything." Zach's expression hardened. "I don't want your money." "I didn't offer you money," she said calmly. "I offered you a night, one where you don't have to be the one doing all the giving." He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "This is a lot." "I know." "And you're serious." "Completely." He exhaled slowly. "You don't get tired of people saying yes just because you're rich." Her reply came without hesitation. "I get tired of people saying yes because they think they should. I'm asking because I want you there. No strings." Zach studied her for a long moment. "You're not like the others, are you?" Paloma's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Not even close. Friday came faster than expected. The suit delivered to his apartment was tailored to his exact measurements, and Ellery's dress looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. There was no price tag on anything, no receipt, just a note that simply said, "See you at 7." The car that picked them up wasn't just black, it shimmered under the city lights like something out of a dream. Ellery couldn't stop staring at the glowing ceiling as they drove, and Zach couldn't stop double-checking the tie he hadn't worn in years. When they arrived at the venue, he nearly stepped out onto the street before the driver opened the door for him. The building itself looked like it had been sculpted out of marble and gold. Inside, chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, and the air buzzed with the soft hum of violins and whispered names. Paloma stood near the entrance in a gown the color of midnight, her hair pinned up with a single silver comb. When she saw them, her eyes lit with something that wasn't surprise but quiet joy. "You clean up well," she said as she approached. Zach glanced around, suddenly aware of every pair of eyes trained on them. "I'm gonna stick out like a sore thumb." "You already do," she said. "That's why everyone's staring." He looked at her warily. "That's supposed to make me feel better." She stepped closer. "No, it's supposed to make you feel seen." Before he could reply, Ellery tugged on Paloma's hand. "Can I go see the books?" Paloma nodded and led them toward a small exhibit where rare first editions were displayed under soft light. Ellery leaned in, wide-eyed, while Paloma crouched beside her. Zach stood back, watching them, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the world was happening without him. He was part of it. Whatever this was. Whoever she was. He wasn't running anymore. 3 weeks later, Zach stood in front of a row of mirrors in a Manhattan tailor's studio, arms held out stiffly as a seamstress adjusted the cuffs of his blazer. Ellery was perched on a velvet stool near the window, swinging her legs and flipping through a picture book Paloma had picked out from an antique store down the block. "Relax your shoulders," the tailor instructed gently. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's life," Zach muttered, eyeing his reflection. Paloma, leaning against the doorframe with her arms folded, raised an eyebrow. "You're wearing your life. I'm just helping you tailor it." Zach glanced over at her. "What exactly are we doing here again?" "There's a dinner next week," she said, stepping closer. "Not one of those black tie galas, just something small, but there'll be people there I'd like you to meet." He narrowed his eyes. "You mean people who might judge me by my shoes?" Paloma reached for his hand and gave it a firm squeeze. "You're not being judged, you're being introduced." "To what?" "To a world that won't swallow you whole," she said, her voice low, steady. "Not if I'm standing next to you." Zach looked down at her hand in his. "You're serious about this?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." The seamstress cleared her throat politely and stepped away, leaving Zach and Paloma alone in the fitting room. He studied her face for a long moment. "I'm not trying to be difficult, I'm just not used to this." "I know," she said, "but I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking you to let yourself belong." He looked back at the mirror. "What if I don't?" Paloma's voice was quiet. "Then I'll be the one out of place." That night, after Ellery was asleep upstairs in the guest room of Paloma's townhouse, where she now stayed every weekend like it was the most natural thing in the world, Zach stepped out onto the terrace that overlooked the garden. Paloma joined him a minute later, barefoot, wrapped in a soft robe, holding 2 mugs of something warm. She handed him one. "Chamomile," she said. "You looked like you needed grounding." Zach took it with a nod, staring out at the moonlight settling on the ivy and stone. "I don't think I've ever seen her this happy," he said. "She talks about you like you're some kind of storybook character." Paloma smiled faintly. "And what about you?" He glanced sideways at her. "I'm still figuring out what kind of story this is." She stepped closer, her voice softer now. "It's the kind where the characters don't have to pretend." Zach turned to face her fully. "You really think this can work?" Paloma didn't answer right away. She set down her mug and reached for his hand again, intertwining their fingers. "I don't think," she said. "I know." Zach exhaled, the tension in his shoulders slowly unspooling. "I've spent a long time trying to keep things small, manageable, safe for Ellery." "I know," she said quietly. "But you don't fit in small spaces." She lifted her chin. "Then let's build something big enough." The next week, the dinner she'd mentioned turned out to be on the rooftop of a penthouse overlooking the Hudson. But it wasn't the location that caught Zach off guard, it was the people. An editor of a publishing house who'd read Ellery's owl drawings and wanted to turn them into a children's book. A philanthropist who ran a program supporting single fathers returning to school. An architect who offered to sketch ideas for a community art space Paloma had been discussing with Ellery over breakfast one morning. Zach kept waiting for the catch, for the moment he'd be asked to leave the room, but it never came. Instead, Paloma stayed next to him the entire night, gently guiding conversations when he got overwhelmed, drawing him back in when his silence stretched a little too long. She never took over. She just stood beside him, steady and sure. Later, when they stood at the edge of the rooftop, watching the river glitter beneath the lights, Zach turned to her. "Did you plan all of this?" She shook her head. "I just opened the door, you walked in." He studied her face, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was staring across some invisible divide. He only saw her clear, open, and entirely real. "I've never had anyone stand beside me like this," he said. "Then let me be the first," she replied. Zach reached for her hand, then paused. "I want this, but I need to do it right." Paloma's brow lifted slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to build something with you, not just step into what's already made." He looked out at the skyline. "I want to bring something of myself to the table." She didn't hesitate. "Then let's build it together." The next morning, Zach enrolled in evening classes for business management, something he'd put off for years. Paloma didn't push. She only asked what he needed to make it work. They hired a part-time sitter for the evenings when Ellery wasn't staying with Paloma. It was never about changing who Zach was. It was about giving him the space to stretch toward who he wanted to be. And slowly, the lines between their worlds blurred not by force, but by choice. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring. Ellery's drawings were published in a limited-run children's book that Paloma never took credit for funding. Zach's nights were filled with textbooks and early morning cafe shifts, but for the first time in years, he didn't dread the grind. Then one day, in the middle of the community garden Paloma had helped fund in Zach's neighborhood, the one where Ellery now taught weekend art classes to younger kids, Zach knelt down in the dirt, with a small velvet box tucked in his palm. Paloma had been helping Ellery refill, paint water, when she turned around and froze. Zach looked up, his voice low, his heart pounding. "I've never had a blueprint for this. I've only had what I feel." Paloma's eyes brimmed instantly. "I can't promise a perfect life, but I can promise honesty and effort, and this crazy, stubborn love I have for you and Ellery." He opened the box. The ring wasn't flashy. It wasn't even new. It had belonged to his mother. "Marry me, not because it fit your world, but because you've helped build mine." Paloma didn't cry. She just smiled, stepped forward, and whispered, "Yes." The applause from the nearby kids broke the quiet, and Ellery ran up to throw her arms around them both. As the sun broke through the clouds overhead, Zach kissed her right there in the garden, with dirt on his knees and Ellery's laughter in his ear. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was theirs. The wedding was small, just like they wanted. Not out of modesty, Paloma could have filled a ballroom at the plaza with a single phone call, but because they both knew what mattered now had nothing to do with chandeliers or champagne fountains. They chose the garden. The same one where Zach had proposed, with its winding stone paths and ivy-covered trellises, now lit with soft golden lanterns that swayed overhead in the early summer breeze. Folding chairs lined the trimmed hedges, and the scent of blooming wisteria drifted through the warm air. Ellery stood at the front, wearing a lavender dress and holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself. Her drawing of an owl and a phoenix, hand-painted in watercolor, was printed onto each invitation and framed at the entrance a quiet nod to the story they'd built together. As Paloma stepped into view, every head turned, but Zach didn't notice anyone but her. The gown she wore was simple, elegant, and nothing like the ones the tabloids used to photograph her in. This one had been designed by a local seamstress she'd met at one of Zach's community events. The dress flowed like water, and at her neckline, she wore a delicate antique locket with a tiny photo of the three of them inside. When she reached him, she didn't speak right away. She just took his hands, and for a moment the world stilled. "I never thought I'd find a home in someone else," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "But you're what home feels like." Zach's voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "I didn't have a map, but I knew the moment I saw you standing in the rain, you'd change everything." They exchanged vows under the sycamore tree with only the people who'd truly mattered in their lives. No press, no announcements, just quiet promises and the soft laughter of Ellery when the wind caught Paloma's veil and lifted it like a kite. When they kissed, it wasn't rehearsed or dramatic. It was deep and sure, like everything that had grown between them stubborn, unexpected, and utterly real. Afterward, the reception was held in the same garden, with food from Zach's favorite neighborhood restaurant served on long wooden tables strung with lights. There was no first dance. Instead, Paloma pulled Ellery into her arms and spun her slowly beneath the stars. Zach joined them, one arm around each of them, the three of them swaying to a string quartet playing somewhere behind a wall of roses. Later, while Ellery dozed inside the townhouse under the watchful eye of Paloma's longtime housekeeper, Zach and Paloma sat on the garden swing, her bare feet brushing the grass. "You know this isn't where I imagined ending up," Zach said, his fingers laced with hers. Paloma rested her head on his shoulder. "I didn't imagine ending up at all. I thought I'd keep building and ascending until there was no one left beside me." He turned to her. "You scared?" She nodded, terrified. "Me too." She looked up at him, "But I've never been more sure of anything." They sat in silence, watching the lanterns flicker in the trees. A week later, they moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, one they bought together. Not hers, not his, theirs. It had big windows, a backyard for Ellery's wildflower garden, and a basement Zach turned into a studio for her art. Paloma continued her work, but she now split her time, investing not just in startups, but in local programs Zach helped her discover. They built something new, not perfect, but real. On Sunday mornings, they made pancakes. On Tuesday nights, Zach still picked up shifts at the cafe not because they needed the money, but because he liked the people. Paloma would sit in the corner booth, laptop open, Ellery beside her, sketching owls in spacesuits and dragons with glasses. One evening, Zach came home to find a note taped to the fridge. "Back garden, bring the flashlight." He stepped outside to find Paloma and Ellery lying on a blanket, staring up at the stars. A telescope stood beside them, and a thermos of hot cocoa steamed quietly in the grass. Ellery looked up. "We're looking for constellations." Paloma patted the blanket beside her. "We found one that looks like a truck." Zach laughed and dropped down beside them. "Of course you did." They lay there, the three of them, arms linked. The city buzzed around them, but inside that garden, time slowed. Paloma turned her face to his. "You know what I realized?" He raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Love isn't just the big things. It's the ordinary things that don't feel ordinary when you're with the right person." He kissed her forehead, then her mouth. "Then, I guess we're doing it right." Ellery yawned beside them. "You're both super cheesy." Zach pulled her close. "That's how you know it's real." And it was. They weren't playing parts anymore. There was no pretending, no hiding. Just a woman who had once ruled boardrooms and learned how to be quiet enough to listen. A man who had once feared he had nothing to offer and discovered he was always enough. And a little girl who had drawn owls that knew secrets because somehow she'd always known theirs would be a love that lasted forever.